Few stories in rock history are as deeply intertwined with friendship and conflict as that of Paul McCartney and George Harrison. They began as boys from Liverpool dreaming of music, but fame and ambition forged a complicated bond filled with loyalty, tension, and unspoken regrets. Decades later, Paul has finally opened up about the silent struggles and deep admiration that lay beneath the surface, shedding light on a brotherhood tested by time, success, and an eventual, heartbreaking goodbye. At first glance, the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison seemed like a seamless brotherhood forged in music and camaraderie. But beneath the surface, tension simmered quietly for years, casting long shadows over their public image as a tight-knit band. The pressures of fame and creative control silently reshaped a friendship that had once felt unbreakable. Paul, naturally confident and driven, grew into the dominant force behind the Beatles' music and decisions. George, equally talented but often overshadowed, struggled to carve out space for his own voice and vision within the group. Despite their early closeness, cracks began to show as their personalities and ambitions diverged. Paul's perfectionism clashed with George's growing desire for artistic independence and spiritual exploration, and these tensions weren't purely professional. They cut deep into personal territory, evolving into years of silence and unresolved grievances. The world only ever saw the finished songs and polished performances. What lay beneath was a complicated bond tangled in loyalty, resentment, and unspoken pain. The strain became increasingly visible during recording sessions, with Paul often directing others in ways that rubbed George the wrong way. At one point, George snapped openly, telling Paul he would play whatever Paul wanted, or not play at all. This rare outburst was a glimpse into a friendship strained by creative dominance and a lack of mutual understanding. George's frustration had been fueled by years of seeing his compositions sidelined while Lennon-McCartney songs took center stage, and those seeds of resentment would take decades to fully address. Yet neither man publicly voiced the full extent of their conflict for many years. Both maintained a facade of respect, though privately the relationship was far more complex. Their silence carried the weight of loyalty mingled with bitterness. Fans sensed something unresolved, but the truth remained hidden beneath layers of fame and carefully guarded privacy. Long before the Beatles became an unstoppable global phenomenon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison's friendship took root in the streets and schools of Liverpool. Their connection began as early as 1954, when they both attended the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was older by a year, already known for his quick wit and musical curiosity, while George was quieter, often struggling to fit into a rigid academic environment he openly disliked. Their real bond formed during extended bus rides across the city. Paul carried a guitar, and when George spotted it, a music conversation began that lasted 3 hours. They discovered they shared a love for the skiffle craze in American rock and roll, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard. George was so moved by the raw energy of songs like Heartbreak Hotel that he began practicing guitar obsessively, drawing instruments in his school notebooks until his fingertips were sore. Paul had grown up in a musical household. His father, Jim, led a jazz band, and had already started learning piano before picking up guitar. He quickly recognized George's dedication and natural ability. By 1956, George was playing in a local skiffle group called the Rebels. The following year, Paul joined John Lennon's band The Quarrymen and soon championed George for the role of second guitarist. John initially hesitated, thinking George looked too young and baby-faced. But George silenced all doubts by flawlessly playing the rockabilly instrumental Raunchy on a Liverpool bus, and from that moment, he was in. The three musicians became inseparable, spending countless hours together playing chords and dreaming about the future. For Paul, who had lost his mother at 14, this friendship offered profound emotional support. For George, it offered validation, confirmation that he belonged alongside more seasoned players. That first bus ride had set in motion one of the most consequential friendships in music history. The Beatles' meteoric rise from Liverpool club favorites to global superstars placed enormous pressure on the relationships within the band. By the mid-1960s, Paul had naturally assumed the role of creative driving force. His vision, perfectionism, and relentless work ethic shaped much of their sound and direction, but this evolution left George increasingly marginalized. George was no longer content being just a quiet one. He had grown into a confident songwriter with a deeply distinct voice. Yet the Lennon-McCartney partnership continued to dominate Beatles' releases, leaving George's compositions frequently overlooked or restricted. The imbalance strained more than just studio schedules. It eroded their personal rapport as well. The tension became most visible during the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. Paul treated the album as his grand orchestrated vision, pushing the boundaries of rock music. George contributed Within You, Without You, a deeply personal piece rooted in his immersion in Indian music and philosophy. To the others, it was just another track on a concept album. To George, it was a profound statement of identity and spiritual search. Their diverging priorities deepened further during the band's famous trip to India in early 1968. George embraced meditation and spiritual practice as genuinely life-changing. Paul approached the experience more casually, a welcome break from work. When Paul joked, "Calm down, Georgia boy," it perfectly illustrated the gulf between them. For George, this was no joking matter. By January 1969, the tensions had become unbearable. During chaotic rehearsals for what would become the Let It Be album, George reached his limit. He described the environment as very unhealthy and unhappy, and on January 10th, he simply walked out. Before leaving, George had quietly accumulated an impressive stockpile of songs, including All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill, all of which the Beatles had repeatedly passed over in favor of Lennon-McCartney compositions. The system had become suffocating. He composed Whoa Whoa on the very day he left, channeling his frustration about Paul's domineering behavior directly into music. George stayed away for 12 days before returning, but the deep fracture lines remained. Later that year, in a private conversation recorded by writer Anthony Fawcett, Paul told John Lennon that George's songs had finally caught up to their own in quality. George dismissed the comment flatly, pointing out he had been writing those songs for years. The exchange was telling. Paul saw George as a late bloomer who had finally arrived. George saw Paul as someone who had simply refused to share creative space and credit all along. That fundamental disconnect fed the rivalry and deepened the emotional wounds. George's feelings found their truest expression in his 1970 masterpiece All Things Must Pass. The song Run of the Mill appeared to address Paul directly, with lyrics asking how he had lost his friendship. The scars of their relationship had found their outlet in music. Despite the chaos of early 1969, that same year also brought one of George Harrison's greatest creative triumphs within the Beatles. When the group convened to record Abbey Road, George contributed two of the album's most celebrated songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something. The latter was so admired that Frank Sinatra later called it the greatest love song ever written, and even John Lennon declared it the best track on the album. For George, this recognition was a long overdue vindication, proof, at last, that his talent extended far beyond his role as the band's lead guitarist. Yet behind the scenes, the rising profile of his songwriting brought more tension than comfort. He resented Paul's continued interference in arrangements, feeling that Paul perpetually underestimated his discipline and creative judgment. Their work was professional, but their personal relationship remained cold and distant. The album was released in September 1969, with the Beatles already unraveling beneath the music's brilliance. The breakup officially came in 1970. George wasted no time. All Things Must Pass, a sweeping triple album, arrived that same year and announced him as a major solo artist. Paul launched his own solo career with the album McCartney, followed by the formation of Wings. The years that followed were marked by irregular contact and guarded interactions. George stated openly in interviews that he could imagine playing with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. The comment stung. Paul, though he managed to appear unbothered in public, privately found it deeply painful. In 1971, George invited Paul to join him at the Concert for Bangladesh, a landmark humanitarian event, and Paul declined, citing logistical concerns. The missed opportunity created a bigger gulf between them. Through the 1970s, their paths diverged further. George pursued spiritual practice, Hindu meditation, and a rich solo career built on introspection. Paul chased commercial success through Wings, achieving global fame on his own terms. They inhabited entirely different worlds despite sharing the same extraordinary past. Gradually, however, Paul began to soften his perspective. He started acknowledging George's songwriting in public, describing him as someone who had written some of the most exceptional songs of their era, an admission of what he had perhaps long recognized but struggled to say aloud. By the early 1990s, time had softened some of the old animosity. On February 11, 1994, Paul and George reunited with Ringo Starr at Paul's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. The project, nicknamed the Threedles by the press, thrilled fans worldwide. But old dynamics resurfaced almost immediately. George arrived with firm opinions, insisting on bringing in his friend Jeff Lynne as producer, and warning Paul that without an external hand, the sessions could get nasty with egos flying. The collaboration produced 2 songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love, but conflicts over arrangements and vocals never fully subsided. 30 years had passed, yet their artistic differences remained intact.